Hey guys, tonight we are going to do something a little different. We're going to travel back in time, not to a grand battle or a royal coronation, but to something much more intimate. We're going to spend a night in a medieval castle. No, the castles you see in movies, all gleaming stone and fluttering banners. Yeah, let's just say the reality was a bit more fragrant. You're about to find out just how romantic it really was to live as a noble. And spoiler alert, your modern nose might not last the first hour. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It really does help the channel. Then while you're at it, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Go ahead and drop your city and the time in the comments below. It's always amazing to see this little community of ours, scattered all across the world, all settling in for the night. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing on a dirt track, or what's left of one. It's less a road and more a suggestion. A wide, muddy ribbon churned into a lumpy mess by the passage of countless wooden cartwheels and iron-shod hooves. In the distance, silhouetted against a gray, overcast sky, is the castle. From here, it looks exactly like you've always imagined. Its stone towers are imposing, punching holes in the skyline. A single, large banner, heavy with recent rain, hangs limply from the tallest keep. Its colors muted. It's a picture of strength, of permanence. It's the stuff of fairy tales. You take a step, and your boot sinks with a soft, squelching sound into the mud. You pull a tray, and the first hint of the castle's true nature wafts up to you. It's not just the earthy smell of damp ground. There's something else woven into it, something sharp and a little bit sour. You start walking, your eyes fixed on the impressive stone gatehouse ahead. The path is slow going, and with every few steps, that strange aroma seems to get a little stronger, a little more complex. First, you pick out the smell of wood smoke, thick and reassuring. It's a familiar, almost comforting scent, but it's quickly overpowered by the much less pleasant, pungent smell of livestock. A small herd of goats is grazing nearby, and the air is thick with their presence. Then, a new layer is added, a deeply unpleasant, acrid stench that makes you instinctively wrinkle your nose. You see the source just off the path, a low, long wooden building with a plume of foul-smelling steam rising from it. This is a tannery, a place where animal hides are turned into leather using a charming cocktail of things you'd rather not think about, like stale urine and animal brains. It's a vital trade, but one that's always, for obvious reasons, kept outside the main walls. As you get closer to the castle, a small, bustling village of wattle and daub huts materializes, huddled right up against the outer defenses. This is where the castle's support system lives: the blacksmiths, the fletchers, the potters, the weavers. Historians still debate the precise legal and social status of these communities, often called a suburb by UN. Were they independent artisans drawn to the protection of the castle, or were they essentially unfree laborers, their lives and work entirely at the mercy of the lord inside? The reality probably lies somewhere in between, varying greatly from place to place. You walk past a blacksmith shop, and the rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil is joined by the bitter smell of coal smoke. But the dominant scent, the one that seems to tie everything together, is the smell of waste. Not just animal waste, though there is plenty of that. To your right, you see a truly monumental pile of refuse at Donegal, or Midden. It's a small mountain of kitchen scraps, oyster shells, broken pottery, soiled animal bedding, and who knows what else, all slowly decomposing in the damp air. It's disgusting, but for an archaeologist of the future, this pile would be a treasure trove, a detailed diary of the castle's daily consumption. This particular fun fact probably doesn't make the smell any better. You give the steaming mound a wide berth, trying to breathe through your mouth. You've finally arrived at the edge of the moat, the last obstacle before the main gate. The castle looms directly above you now, its stone walls seeming to blot out the sky. The initial romantic image has been thoroughly smudged by the reality on the ground. The air is a thick soup of smells: wood smoke, sweat, animals, tanning chemicals, and the all-pervading, sweetish scent of decay. It's the smell of life, unfiltered and unmanaged. The drawbridge is down. A heavy wooden ramp spanning the murky water below. It's your entrance. You take a deep breath, a decision you might immediately regret, and prepare to step into the world of the medieval castle. You take a hesitant step onto the drawbridge, the thick, weathered planks of wood groan under your weight, the sound echoing slightly over the still water below. Your first instinct is to look down, and that's a mistake you won't make twice. The moat is not the sparkling, swan-filled waterway of your imagination. It is a stagnant, soupy mess, the color of overbrewed tea, with a greasy, rainbow-hued film shimmering on its surface. Bubbles slowly rise and pop, releasing little puffs of a smell so foul it makes the tannery seem pleasant by comparison. It's a thick, cloying stench of rotten sulfur, the kind of smell that feels like it's coating the inside of your mouth. You see things floating in it, scraps of what might be vegetable peelings, a piece of wood covered in green slime, a sodden lump of cloth, and something that looks disturbingly like the bone of a large animal. Picked clean, this wasn't just a defensive feature. It was the castle's primary dumpster. Everything that couldn't be burned, buried, or fed to the dogs often ended up here. Think of it as the ultimate medieval out of sight, out of mind solution. From the kitchen, the remnants of the day's butchering guts, heads, and other unsavory bits would be chucked over the wall. From the great hall, buckets of slops and spoiled wine would be unceremoniously dumped. It was a convenient, gravity-fed disposal system. Now, not all moats were wet moats. Some were dry ditches, deep and formidable in their own right. But for a wet moat like this, its effectiveness as a garbage chute was a major perk. This leads to a fascinating bit of historical trivia: the job of cleaning these things out. Occasionally, when the build-up became too much, a poor soul known as a gong farmer or gong farmauer would be hired to dredge the moat. Gong was an old English word for dung or privy. It was one of the most disgusting, and yet surprisingly well paid, jobs in the medieval world. These men worked only at night, scooping the accumulated sludge into carts to be taken away and used as fertilizer. The pay was good because the social stigma, and the smell that clung to them, was immense. You force yourself to look away from the murky water and focus on your destination. The gatehouse at the far end of the bridge. The walk feels longer than it is. The air hanging over the moat is heavy and still, trapping the odor. You can feel it on your skin, a damp, unpleasant miasma. This very unpleasantness, however, was part of its defensive genius. Historians still argue about this point. Was the extreme filth of the moat a deliberate part of the castle's defense, or was it just a convenient but unfortunate byproduct of poor sanitation? On one hand, a moat filled with sewage and decaying matter was a powerful deterrent. Imagine trying to wade or swim across that, let alone trying to place siege ladders against the wall while standing in it. Any cut or scrape could easily lead to a fatal infection. Some scholars suggest that the filth was an intentional, low-tech form of biological warfare. On the other hand, many historians argue that this gives medieval lords too much credit for strategic thinking about hygiene. They contend that the moat was simply the easiest place to throw refuse, and any defensive benefit was a happy accident. They point out that such a stagnant, festering body of water right outside your front door would also pose a significant health risk to the castle's own inhabitants, breeding flies and disease. The truth, as is often the case, probably varied from castle to castle, depending on the lord's priorities and the castle's specific layout. You are about halfway across now. The groaning of the wooden planks beneath your feet is the only sound you're focused on. A small anchor in this sensory assault. You try to take shallow breaths. To your right, you notice a small, stone-lined channel running down the castle wall, ending a few feet above the moat's surface. A dark, wet-stain fans out from it, as licking the stones. You have a sinking feeling you know what that is, and you'll get a much closer look at its source later. For now, You just register it as another source of input into this foul stew. You're finally reaching the end of the drawbridge. The immense stone arch of the gatehouse looms over you, casting you in a cool shadow. The air immediately changes. It's still not fresh, not by a long shot, but it's different. It's thicker, with the smells of the interior, the scent of hay, animals, and the distant, enticing smell of baking bread. A single, hopeful note in a symphony of stench. You take your last step off the drawbridge and onto the solid, grimy cobblestones of the outer courtyard. You've made it across. You're inside, and you can't help but feel that you've just passed the first test of your medieval adventure. You survived the moat. You step under the massive arch of the gatehouse, and the world narrows. For a moment, you are in a dark, cool tunnel. The clatter of your footsteps on the cobblestones bounces off the thick stone walls. You look up and see the murder holes in the ceiling above, small, circular openings through which defenders could drop rather unpleasant things on uninvited guests. You also see the giant iron portcullis, a heavy, spiked gate, currently raised high into a recess, its teeth looking like a row of daggers aimed at the ground. It's a chilling reminder that this place is, above all else, a fortress. Then you emerge into the light of the inner bailey, or courtyard. Then the full scope of the castle's daily life hits you. It is a whirlwind of organized chaos. To your left, a stable boy is mucking out a stall, tossing soiled straw onto a growing pile. The sharp, ammonia-like smell is potent. Chickens peck at the ground around your feet, completely unfazed by your presence. Two large, shaggy dogs are wrestling playfully near a water trough. The ground underfoot isn't paved with neat flagstones, but is a mixture of packed earth, gravel, and, in many places, leaden mud. You have to watch where you step. Your destination is the heart of the castle, the Great Hall. It's the largest building in the bailey, its heavy oak doors thrown wide open. As you approach, the sounds from within grow louder, a low murmur of voices, the occasional bark of a dog, the distant clatter of pots and pans from the adjoining kitchens. You step over the threshold, and the scene inside is something to behold. The hall is enormous. The high, vaulted ceiling with massive wooden beams, blackened by centuries of soot, stretches high above. The air is thick and hazy with smoke from a large, central fire pit that's doing a mediocre job of channeling its output through a hole in the roof. Your eyes sting a little. The light is dim, filtering in through a few high, narrow windows that are more like slits in the stone than actual glass panes. This washed for lack of glass, which did exist, but for defensive purposes. Large windows are a weakness, but it's the floor that truly captures your attention. It's not stone or wood. It's covered in a thick layer of what looks like dried grass and herbs. This is rushes, a general term for various reeds, hay, and sweet-smelling herbs like meadows, and chamomile that were strewn across the floor. In theory, this was a brilliant idea. It provided a soft, insulating layer underfoot. When fresh, would release a pleasant scent when crushed by people's feet. A lovely, rustic, and organic solution to cold stone floors. You take a step onto the rushes. There's a soft crunch. You look down. What you thought was just dried plant matter is something else entirely. Mingled with the rushes are discarded food scraps. Small animal bones, probably from a chicken wing, gnawed on and tossed aside in a sizable smear of grease. This is where the theory and the reality of rush floors diverge dramatically. The problem was the rushes themselves, but the maintenance schedule, or lack thereof. Instead of replacing the rushes daily, servants would often just sweep the worst of the debris away and lay a fresh layer on top. This created a kind of medieval lasagna of filth. Underneath the deceptively fresh-looking top layer was a compressed, slowly decomposing mat of weeks, or even months, worth of accumulated mess. Erasmus, the 16th century scholar, famously complained about English floors, describing them as a vile collection of spittle, vomit, the urine of dogs and men, ale droppings, scraps of fish, and other abominations not fit to be mentioned. This layered flooring system created a perfect breeding ground for fleas, lice, and other vermin. It also produced a unique, musty, slightly sour smell that permeated the entire hall. It's a smell that would have been completely normal to the people living here. The background sense of home. To you, it's a bit overwhelming. You can almost feel the texture of the floor through the soles of your boots, spongy in some places, sticky in others. There's a debate among historians about how universal this practice was. Some argue that the most damning descriptions, like Erasmus's, were exaggerated, part of a common trope of writers complaining about the barbaric customs of foreigners. They suggest that in well-managed, high-status households, the rushes would have been changed much more frequently, perhaps even daily. A quirky little fact is that sometimes valuable items would be lost in the rushes. There are records of lords and ladies losing rings or small brooches, prompting a frantic sifting of the floor coverings by servants. Imagine trying to find a silver ring in that mess. You look around the hall. At the far end is the dais, a raised platform where the lord and his family would sit at a long table, separated from the lower-ranking members of the household. The rest of the hall is filled with long, rough-hewn trestle tables and benches. This was a communal space in every sense of the word. It was the dining room, the courtroom, the office, and for many of the lower-ranking servants, the bedroom. Tonight, after the tables are cleared, many of them will simply wrap themselves in a cloak and find a spot to sleep on these very rushes. You suddenly find yourself very grateful for the concept of a private bedroom with a clean floor. For now, you just try to get used to the strange feeling of walking on history's dirtiest carpet. The low hum of activity in the great hall continues around you. People are mending tools, chatting in small groups, and a few off-duty guards are playing a game with dice on a small wooden stool. Their laughter sharp and loud, but your attention is drawn to the remnants of the midday meal, which haven't been fully cleared away. While the main trestle tables have been wiped down with damp cloths, the evidence of the feast is everywhere, especially underfoot. This is where you get a real sense of medieval table manners, or perhaps the lack thereof. You see, the polite society of the castle didn't have personal plates for much of its history. Instead, they used trunchers. These were thick, flat slabs of steel braid, about 4 days old, so they were hard enough to serve as an absorbent plate. You'd be given a truncheon, and the cooks would ladle stew or place roasted meat directly onto it. You'd eat the food off the bread, and when you were done, you had a choice. If you were still hungry, you could eat your gravy-soaked plate. More commonly, however, the trenchers were collected and given as alms to the poor waiting outside the castle gates, or, even more likely, they were simply tossed to the dogs. And the dogs are everywhere. They are not the well-groomed pets you might imagine. They are working animals, mostly large, rangy hounds used for hunting, but they have the run of the hall. You watch as a particularly scruffy-looking dog with muddy paws sniffs its way along the edge of the dais, its tail wagging hopefully. It finds what it's looking for, a pile of bones. During the meal, it was common practice to simply throw unwanted bones and gristle onto the floor. The dogs acted as the first wave of the cleanup crew, a kind of four-legged, self-propelled vacuum cleaner. You walk closer to one of the now empty tables and see the greasy sheen left on the wood. There were no individual forks for eating. Those were an Italian invention and were viewed with deep suspicion in much of medieval Europe for centuries, seen as foppish and unnecessary. You ate with your fingers, a personal dagger for cutting meat, and a spoon for soups or pottage. The communal nature of dining meant you were often sharing a drinking goblet with your neighbor, and dipping your hands into the same serving bowls. The floor was the only thing that got messy. Imagine the scene during a full-blown banquet. The hall would be packed, noisy, and hot. Servants would be rushing back and forth with platters of roasted peacock, boar's head, and meat pies. Wine and ale would be flowing freely. People would be eating with gusto, grease running down their chins and onto their sleeves. Scraps would be flying. Spills were inevitable. The rushes on the floor would be catching it all. Spilled wine, dribbled gravy, globs of fat, and a constant rain of bones. By the end of the night, the floor would be a treacherous, sticky minefield, A fascinating little detail of medieval feasting is the voider. This was the person, but a large, often ornate, tray or basket. Towards the end of a course, a servant would come around with the voider, and diners would scrape the leftover bones and inedible bits from their trenchers into it. It was a gesture towards tidings, but in a loud, crowded, and boisterous hall. A lot of the mess still ended up on the floor. Historians are still debating how consistently practices like using a voider were followed. Was it a strict rule of etiquette in high-end households, or more of a general guideline that was often ignored in the heat of the feast? The archaeological evidence from the floors of excavated halls, which are often full of animal bones, suggests it was probably the latter. Now, consider the aftermath. After the lord and his family have retired, and the guests have staggered off to bed, what happens to the hall? The dogs would have their fill, but they couldn't eat everything. The servants would do a cursory sweep, but as we've established, they were more likely to cover the mess than to remove it entirely. This organic matter, trapped in the rush flooring, would begin to decompose slowly in the damp, cool environment of a stone castle. This process would create that persistent, musty odor you're still trying to get used to. You look down at your feet again, at the innocent-looking layer of reeds and herbs, and you have a newfound respect for the robustness of the medieval stomach and nose. This wasn't seen as disgusting. It was just the way things were. The concept of microbial germs was centuries away. If something didn't produce an immediate, overpowering, vomit-inducing stench, it was generally considered harmless. The connection between decaying filth on the floor and the stomachache you might get a few days later simply wasn't made. You are standing in the middle of a petri dish the size of a tennis court, a testament to a time when the visible and the invisible worlds of hygiene were entirely separate. The after-party in a medieval castle wasn't so much a vibe as it was a slow, creeping process of decay right under every owner's feet. You decide to leave the great hall and its unique flooring behind for a moment. You follow a narrow, dark corridor leading away from the main space, drawn by the increasing clutter, then a much more appetizing smell. Baking bread and roasting meat. This passage takes you to the nerve center of the castle's culinary world, the kitchen. You step through an arched doorway and into a cavern of heat and activity. The kitchen is a separate structure, or at least in a separate wing, from the great hall. This was a very deliberate and sensible fire safety measure, with the massive open fires needed to cook for 100 people or more. Keeping the kitchen detached from the main living quarters was just common sense. The room is huge, with a ceiling so high it's lost in smoke and shadows. There are at least 2 colossal fireplaces, big enough for a person to walk into, with whole lambs and pigs turning on spits over glowing beds of embers. The heat hits you in a wave. The floor is paved with uneven flagstones, slick with water and grease. A couple of young boys are dashing back and forth, carrying buckets of water from a nearby well, sloshing it onto the floor to wash away the worst of the grime before swishing it out a low-level drain that empties into the courtyard. It's a constant, Sisyphean task. The air is a chaotic but not unpleasant mix of smells. Roasting meat, simmering herbs, baking bread, wood smoke, and the sweat of the harried kitchen staff. You see cooks, their faces flushed from the heat, shouting instructions over the din. They are chopping vegetables on massive wooden tables, their knives a blur of motion. A woman is kneading a mountain of dough in a huge wooden trough. It's a picture of productivity and abundance. But as your eyes adjust, you start to notice the details that your modern sensibilities find questionable. There's no real concept of separate surfaces for different foods. A cook might chop raw chicken on a thick wooden block. Then, without much more than a cursory wipe with a dirty rag, use the same surface to slice a loaf of bread. Cross-contamination isn't a concept, it's a way of life. You see a large barrel of salted fish, and flies are buzzing lazily around its open top. No one seems to notice or care. It's just part of the kitchen's ecosystem. Animals are also part of this ecosystem. While the dogs from the Great Hall are generally kept out, the kitchen has its own resident cats. They are not cuddly pets, but lean, mean-looking hunters, prized for their ability to keep the rodent population in check. You see a ginger Tom slinking along a high shelf, its eyes fixed on a sack of flour from which a small mouse might dare to emerge. It's a practical solution to a persistent problem. But the thought of cat hair and dander in the place where your food is prepared is a little unsettling. Here's a weirdly specific hygiene fact for you. The spit boy, or spitjack. This was often the lowest ranking job in the kitchen, assigned to a young boy. His only task was to sit by the roaring fire for hours on end, slowly and constantly turning the spits so the meat would cook evenly. It was hot, tedious, and mind-numbingly boring. To protect the meat from the boy's sweat and dripping nose, a small shield was sometimes placed between him and the roast. More often, though, the seasoning was just considered part of the flavor. To make matters worse, to keep the meat moist, they would lard it, using a large brush or cloth to baste it with fat. The pan catching the drippings below was often an open invitation for ashen cinders from the fire to pop in. The historical debate here revolves around the actual cleanliness of the food. Were medieval people constantly sick from food poisoning? Some historians argue that the heavy use of spices, like cloves, nutmeg, and pepper, which were hugely expensive and a major status symbol, washed just for flavor. Many of these spices have powerful antibacterial properties. They suggest that dousing meat in these spices might have helped to kill off some of the surface bacteria, making slightly less than fresh meat safer to eat. Others argue this is an overstatement of the spices' effects and that their use was purely about showcasing wealth. They propose that medieval people simply had much hardier immune systems, built up from a lifetime of exposure to bacteria that would lay a modern person low for a week. The truth is likely a combination of both. You watch as a cook takes a large joint of beef off a hook on the wall. It's been hanging there, uncovered, for who knows how long. He slaps it down on the wooden table, startling a fly that was resting on it, and begins to carve. Nearby, another cook is plucking a chicken, sending a small cloud of flying feathers and dander into the air, which swirls and settles indiscriminately. There's no running water in the modern sense. Water has to be hauled, bucket by bucket, from the well or a cistern. It's used for boiling, for washing vegetables a quick dunk in a tub of murky water, and for that endless washing of the floor. There is no soap for washing hands in the kitchen. You might rinse them in a bucket of cold water, but that's about it. Yet, despite all of this, the food being produced looks and smells incredible. It's a paradox. A process that would fail every modern health inspection is creating a feast fit for a king. You realize that cleanliness is a relative term, and in the medieval kitchen, clean enough was the only standard that mattered. Leaving the frantic heat of the kitchen, you step back out into the slightly cooler air of the courtyard. The brief, tantalizing smell of roasted meat is replaced once again by the familiar barnyard scent of the Bailey. You saw the boys hauling buckets of water into the kitchen, and it makes you wonder, where does all this water come from? Your eyes scan the courtyard and land on the source of all life in the castle. The well. It looks sturdy and reliable. A low, circular stone wall, about waist high, surrounds the opening. A wooden structure is built over it, with a roof to keep out the worst of the rain and debris, and a spindle with a rope and bucket attached. It's centrally located, easily accessible from the kitchens, the stables, and the main keep. On the surface, it's a picture of medieval engineering. This well was often the first thing to be dug when a castle was built. A secure, internal water source was non-negotiable. You couldn't withstand a siege for more than a few days without it. A woman is there now, cranking the handle, with a rhythmic squeaking. She hauls a dripping wooden bucket up from the dark depths. She unhooks it, balances it on her hip, and trudges off towards the laundry shed. The water that sloshes over the rim onto the muddy ground looks clear enough, but you know better than to judge a book by its cover, or in this case, water by its clarity. Let's think about where this water is coming from. It's groundwater, rainwater that has seeped down through the earth and collected in an underground aquifer. The well is just a shaft sunk down to tap into it. In a pristine, natural environment, this water would be filtered by the layers of soil and rock, making it remarkably pure. The problem is, a castle is anything but a pristine, natural environment. You are standing in the middle of a bustling, densely populated community, and all of its waste has to go somewhere. The ground under your feet is saturated with stuff. The stables, with their constant output of horse manure and urine, are just over there. The dunigal, that festering pile of kitchen and household waste, is slowly leaching its own foul juices into the soil. The cesspits, which we'll get to later, are underground tanks designed to hold human waste, and they are notoriously leaky. And don't forget the general grime of the courtyard itself, the animal droppings, the slops thrown from doorways, the waste from various craft activities like dyeing or brewing. All of this filth, every last drop, soaks into the ground. And where does it go? It seeps downwards, following the same path as the rainwater, heading directly for the aquifer that feeds the well. The well, in essence, is drinking the castle's own recycled sewage. The concept of a seepage radius was completely unknown. They wouldn't have understood that placing a latrine 50 feet away from a well meant they were, in a very real sense, connected. This brings us to a strange and somewhat disgusting piece of trivia. Water tasting. Before modern testing, one of the ways people judged water quality was by its taste. A skilled alewife or brewer could allegedly tell by the taste of the water whether it was hard or soft, and this would affect how they brewed their ale. While they didn't know about bacteria, they did know that water from certain sources just felt better or produced better results. There are even accounts of water diviners who claimed they could find the purest sources, but for the most part, if the water looked clear and didn't have an overt smell or taste of sewage, it was deemed good to drink. The great historical debate here is about the health consequences. Did medieval people know their water was making them sick? It's a tricky question. On one hand, they weren't fools. They could clearly associate drinking from a truly foul, stagnant pond with getting sick. This is one of the reasons they so highly prized alcoholic beverages like beer and ale. The brewing process, which involved boiling the water, unknowingly sterilized it. The alcohol content then helped keep it safe. For the upper classes, wine served the same purpose. Drinking beer or small ale, a weaker version, was often a safer bet than drinking water, especially in a town or castle. On the other hand, the link between a specific water source and chronic, low-level illnesses like diarrhea or stomach cramps was much harder to pin down. They attributed such ailments to all sorts of other causes, an imbalance of the humors in the body, bad air or miasma, or even divine displeasure. They lacked the germ theory of disease that would allow them to connect the invisible microbes in the well water to the sickness in their guts. So, they kept drinking from the contaminated well. Because what other choice did they have? You watch as another servant lowers the bucket back down into the darkness. The thought of drinking a cup of that water sends a shiver down your spine. Yet, for the 100 or so people living within these walls, this single shaft was their lifeline. That was used for drinking, for cooking, for brewing, and for cleaning. It was a source of life that was, paradoxically, also a potential source of constant, low-grade illness and occasional, full-blown dysentery outbreaks. It's a powerful reminder of how vulnerable people were, not just to enemy armies, but to the invisible dangers they unknowingly cultivated right in the heart of their own homes. Your contemplation of the well is interrupted by the sound of a bell ringing from the main keep. It's a signal that the evening meal is soon to be served. People start to move with more purpose, finishing their tasks and heading back towards the great hall. You follow the flow of the crowd, preparing yourself once more for the unique atmosphere of the main dining area. As you re-enter the hall, you notice something new. Servants are moving among the assembling nobles and higher-ranking household members, carrying ewers, ornate pitchers and basins. They approach a guest, who holds out their hands over the basin. The servant then pours a stream of scented water over their fingertips. The guest rubs their fingers together briefly, then dries them on a linen towel offered by another servant. It's a moment of delicate, refined ritual amidst the general roughness of the hall. This is the ceremonial hand washing, a standard part of aristocratic dining etiquette. It looks like a nod to hygiene, a sensible precaution before eating a meal with your hands. And on the surface, it is. But the reality is a little more complex. This act was as much about sociology as it was about sanitation. First, let's look at the practical side. You've been wandering around the castle. You've seen the state of the floors, the courtyard, the animals. People's hands were, to put it mildly, not clean. Washing them before dipping them into communal food bowls was a pretty good idea. The water was oft unwarmed and scented with herbs like rosemary or lavender, or with expensive imported spices like cloves. This washed just to make it smell nice, but to help cut through the grease and grime that might be on a person's hands. However, the ritual was also pure social theater. Notice who is getting their hands washed. It's the Lord, his family, and their honored guests on the days. The further down the social ladder you go, the less likely you are to receive this personal service. A lower-ranking knight might have to share a basin with a few others. The men at arms at the far end of the hall. They'd be lucky to get a quick rinse in a bucket of cold water. If that, the washing of hands, was a public demonstration of status, the quality of your urine basin, the scent of your water, and the very fact that you had a servant dedicated to this task all broadcast your importance to the rest of the hall. Herein lies a curious detail of medieval life. The obsession with fragrant smells as a marker of class. Filth was common, but bad smells were associated with the peasantry and with sin and decay. The nobility fought a constant battle to surround themselves with pleasant aromas. Scented hand-washing water, incense burned in the hall, potpourri, and personal pomme and duress, which we'll get to later, were all part of an olfactory armor that separated the rich from the poor. The clean, floral scent of your hands was a sign that you were above the muck and grime of the common world. The historical debate surrounding this practice centers on its true purpose. Was it a genuine, if rudimentary, attempt at hygiene, born from an empirical understanding that clean hands were better than dirty ones? Or was it almost entirely a symbolic ritual of purification and status, with any health benefits being purely coincidental? Many food historians lean towards the latter. They argue that if it were really about hygiene, the practice would have been more widespread and less ceremonial. The water itself was often reused, passed from one guest to another, diminishing any real cleansing effect with each use. Furthermore, the etiquette books of the time focus far more on the symbolism than the sanitation. They instruct you not to spit in the washing basin or blow your nose on the towel, rules that suggest the primary concern was politeness and ritual purity, not germ theory. It was about showing respect for your host and your fellow diners. You washed your hands not to avoid sickening your neighbor, but to avoid offending them. You watch as the lord of the castle, a large man with a thick beard, meticulously washes his fingertips. He doesn't scrub his hands. He performs a delicate little dance with the water, a gesture that is both practiced and performative. The servant bows and moves on to the lady of the castle. The whole process is quiet, elegant, and strangely intimate. It's a fascinating contradiction. In a world with so much systemic and unavoidable filth, these small islands of ritual cleanliness were fiercely maintained. It shows that medieval people weren't oblivious to the concept of being clean. They just defined it differently. Cleanliness wasn't about being sterile or germ-free. It was about order, propriety, and separating oneself from the dirtier aspects of life. As you find your place at one of the lower tables where no urine basin are forthcoming, you discreetly wipe your own hands on your trousers. It may not be a scented, aristocratic ritual, but under the circumstances, it feels like a wise move. The feast is about to begin, and you're going to need your hands ready. The evening meal is as hearty and chaotic as you imagined. The air grows thick with the smell of food and the rising volume of conversation and laughter. As the wine and ale flow, the atmosphere becomes more relaxed, more boisterous. After the meal, as the servants clear the trenchers and bones, you overhear a conversation that piques your interest. The lady of the castle is announcing that tomorrow she will take a bath and invites one of her visiting noble women to join her. This isn't a casual mention, it's a significant social event. There is a pervasive myth that people in the Middle Ages never bathed. This is almost entirely untrue. What is true is that bathing was a much more complicated, expensive, and infrequent affair than it is today. Taking a full body, hot water bath was a luxury, a treat, and often a social occasion. It was a daily routine, but it was certainly a part of life, especially for the wealthy. Let's follow the process. When a lord or lady decided to bathe, it set in motion a flurry of activity. First, a suitable location had to be chosen. In the summer, this might be a lavish tent set up in a private garden. In the winter, it would be in their private chamber, the solar, which was usually one of the warmer, less drafty rooms in the castle. A large wooden tub, resembling a shallow barrel, would be brought in by servants. These tubs were often lined with a linen cloth to prevent splinters and to make it feel a bit more luxurious. Then came the biggest challenge, the water. Remember our friend the well. Servants would have to haul bucket after bucket of water from the courtyard up to the lord's chambers. But cold water does not a pleasant bath make, so a fire would be roaring in the chamber's fireplace, and pots and cauldrons would be filled with water and set to heat. This was a slow, smoky process. Once heated, the hot water would be poured into the tub and mixed with cold water to achieve the perfect temperature. It was an incredibly labor-intensive operation, requiring multiple servants and a significant amount of firewood. This alone is why bathing was a rare event. Once the bath was ready, the bather wouldn't dress and step in, but they rarely bathed alone. A bath was an excellent opportunity for socializing. It was common for a husband and wife to bathe together. A lady might invite her closest companions to join her, where they would chat, gossip, and be served wine and small snacks on floating wooden rays. It was the medieval equivalent of a spa day. This public and social aspect of bathing strikes our modern sensibilities as very strained. But, in a world with little concept of personal privacy, it was perfectly normal to make the experience more pleasant. They would add things to the bathwater, much like the scented hand-washing water. They would throw in handfuls of fragrant herbs like chamomile, lavender, or rose petals. This was just for the nice smell. These herbs were also believed to have medicinal properties, to soften the skin or to balance the body's humors. For soap, they used a soft, lye-based substance, often made from animal fat and wood ash, sometimes scented with herbs. It was the hard, milled bar soap we know today, but more of a pungent, greasy paste. A particularly weird bathing fact is the existence of public bathhouses, or stews. In medieval towns, these were popular social hubs where people could pay to use hot tubs. However, they quickly gained a reputation for being associated with prostitution, to the point where the name stews became a euphemism for a brothel. This reputation may have contributed to the decline in the popularity of public bathing in the later Middle Ages, as it became associated with immorality. The historical argument here revolves around the frequency and purpose of bathing. Did they bathe for cleanliness or for pleasure and health? Most evidence suggests it was a mix of all three. While they didn't understand germs, they did understand the basic feeling of well-being that came from being clean. Medical treatises of the time often prescribed baths as a treatment for various ailments, but the sheer effort and expense involved meant it was also, undeniably, a status symbol and a form of entertainment. A lord taking a bath was showing off his wealth, that he could afford the firewood, the servants' time, and the luxury of leisure. As you picture the scene, the steaming tub in the firelit chamber, the scent of herbs in the air, the quiet conversation over a floating tray of wine, it seems almost idyllic. It's a stark contrast to the grime of the courtyard and the mess of the great hall. It represents a desire for comfort, for a small pocket of cleanliness and warmth, in a world that was often cold and dirty. But then you remember the source of that water, hauled up from the communal well, and you realize that even in this most intimate and luxurious of rituals, the underlying sanitary challenges of the castle were never truly far away. The bath might wash the dirt from your skin, but the water itself carried its own invisible history. The idea of a warm, herbal bath is still lingering in your mind as you observe the people around you in the great hall. You notice the fabrics they're wearing. The lord and his family are dressed in rich velvets and wools dyed in deep, vibrant colors: crimson, royal blue, and dark green. Their clothes look relatively clean and well maintained. As you look further down the social scale, the clothes become plainer, the colors more muted shades of brown and yellow, and the signs of wear and tear are more obvious. You see stains, frayed cuffs, and patches. This makes you wonder, how did anyone keep their clothes clean in this environment? Washing clothes today is a simple chore. You toss them in a machine, add some detergent, and press a button. In the Middle Ages, it was a major, physically demanding operation known as bucking, and it certainly didn't happen every day. For most people, clothes were worn until they were visibly soiled or started to smell really offensive, given the smoky, greasy, and generally grimy environment of the castle. This didn't take long. Let's walk through the process. The castle's laundry operation would be located near a water source, either the main well, or, if they were lucky, a stream running near the outer walls. The primary cleaning agent was soap, which was an expensive commodity reserved for bathing the body. If that, the workhorse of medieval laundry was lye. This is a powerful, caustic alkaline solution, and they made it themselves. The process of making lye was known as leaching. Servants, usually women known as lavenders, would collect wood ash from the castle's many fireplaces. This ash was packed into a large barrel with a layer of straw or twigs at the bottom to act as a filter. Then, hot water would be slowly poured over the ash. The water would trickle down, dissolving the potassium hydroxide from the ash, then drip out of a small hole at the bottom of the barrel as a yellowish, slippery, and highly corrosive liquid. This was why the dirty clothes, mostly made of linen for undergarments and wool for outer garments, would be placed in a large wooden tub. The lye solution, often diluted with more water, would be poured over them. Then the real work began. The lavenders would use large wooden paddles or poles to pound and agitate the clothes, a process that could go on for hours. This was the bucking that gave the whole process its name. Sometimes they would tread on the clothes with their bare feet, a practice that must have been hell on the skin. This combination of chemical action from the lye and physical force from the pounding would loosen the dirt and grease. After the bucking, the clothes would be rinsed, which meant hauling more buckets of water. Finally, they were taken to a meadow or patch of grass, spread out under the sun, and left to dry and be bleached by the sunlight. The whole affair was an all-day event, undertaken perhaps once a month, or even less frequently for a large household. This brings us to a rather bizarre and pungent laundry aid. Urine. Yes, you read that right. Urine, being rich in ammonia, is an excellent cleaning, unwhitening agent. Stale urine, in which the urea has broken down into ammonia, is particularly effective. In some places, large vats would be kept to collect it for laundry purposes, especially for tackling stubborn stains or for bleaching linen. While more commonly associated with industrial processes like tanning, its use in a domestic laundry setting is documented. It was a free, readily available, and surprisingly effective chemical. The smell, one can only imagine, was rinsed out in the final stage. The historical debate here is about the effectiveness and frequency of washing. Did this arduous process actually get clothes clean? And how often did people really do it? Some historians argue that for the wealthy, maintaining clean linen was a major priority. White linen cuffs and collars were a key status symbol, peeking out from under expensive woolen robes. A pristine white collar signified that you were rich enough to afford not just the linen itself, but the immense labor required to keep it clean. They point to household records that show large quantities of soap and ash being purchased, suggesting a regular and thorough laundry schedule. Other historians argue this was the exception. For the vast majority of the castle's residents, the guards, the servants, the stable hands laundry was a much rarer event. Their woolen outer garments might only be washed once or twice a year, or simply brushed and aired out to get rid of the worst of the dirt and smell. Undergarments, if they wore them, would be washed more frequently, but the standard of clean was likely far lower. They argue that most people, for most of the time, were walking around in clothes that were, by our standards, quite filthy. You look at the knight sitting near you. His woolen tunic has a dark stain near the hem that looks suspiciously like dried mud, and a grease spot on the sleeve. It doesn't look new, but it's functional for him and for everyone else here. Clothes were first and foremost practical and durable. Cleanliness was a bonus, a luxury even. The sheer amount of labor, why, and, perhaps, urine required to achieve it meant that a truly clean garment was a fleeting and precious thing. Your journey through the sensory landscape of the castle has so far covered food, floors, and fabrics, but there's one fundamental human need we haven't yet addressed. As the evening wears on, you feel a call of nature. You quietly ask a passing servant where one might find the privy, or as it was more elegantly known in noble households, the garderobe. The servant points you towards a small, inconspicuous doorway at the corner of the main keep. You follow his directions, heading down a short, narrow, and dark stone passage. The air grows cooler and carries a distinct, sharp, ammonia-like smell that tells you you're on the right track. The passage ends at a thick wooden door. You push it open and step inside. Welcome to the medieval toilet. It is a small, cold, stone chamber, barely larger than a closet. There is no window, only a narrow ventilation slit high up in the wall that does little to circulate the air. The toilet itself is essentially a stone or wooden bench built against the outer wall of the castle. A hole, usually keyhole-shaped or circular, is cut into the bench. That's it. No porcelain bowl, no flushing mechanism, no water tank. It is startlingly simple. You peer down into the hole. It's just a dark, open space. You can't see the bottom. You can, however, hear a faint, distant whisper of wind. This is because you are sitting on top of a long, vertical chute built into the thickness of the castle's massive stone walls. This chute dropped straight down the outside of the building. The name garderobe is French for wardrobe, and this is where our first piece of curious trivia comes in. It's believed they were given this name because people would hang their clothes in these toilet shafts. The acrid ammonia fumes rising from the waist below were a powerful insecticide. Hanging your expensive woolen fur robes in the toilet was a surprisingly effective way to kill fleas, lice, and moths. It's a rather brilliant, if pungent, form of pest control. You are, in effect, sitting in a small room cantilevered off the side of the castle, or within a thickened part of the wall. The experience is not for the faint of heart. It would be drafty, to say the least. In the winter, the cold wind would whistle up the chute, making for a very brisk experience. There's a reason many contemporary illustrations show people using the garderobe while still fully clothed unwrapped in their cloaks. For wiping, there was no toilet paper. If you were lucky, you might have access to scraps of soft cloth or linen. More commonly, you might use moss, hay, or even leaves that were gathered and left in a basket. For the less fortunate, a hand in a nearby bucket of water would have to suffice. The concept of personal hygiene in this most private of moments was vastly different from our own. The location of these garderobes was a matter of both convenience and strategy. There would usually be several, scattered throughout the castle. The lord and lady would have a private one adjoining their solar. Others would be placed at the ends of hallways or near communal sleeping areas. Their design, with the long drop, was meant to carry the waste as far away from the main living quarters as possible. This leads to a historical debate. How sophisticated was the plumbing of these castles? While the chute system seems primitive, some castles had surprisingly advanced features. Historians and archaeologists have found evidence of interconnected systems of stone-lined drains and channels designed to direct waste. In some castles built near rivers, the garderobe chutes would empty directly into the flowing water, creating a self-cleaning system. At the Cistercian monastery in Yorkshire, England, a complex system diverted a river to run underneath the monk's latrine block, creating a constant, flushing sewer. However, These were the high-tech exceptions for most castles. Like the one you're in, the design was much simpler and led to its own set of problems. The waste didn't just vanish, it had to go somewhere. And where it went was directly down the side of the castle wall, which we will explore next. The argument among scholars is whether to view these garderobes as a clever piece of engineering for their time integrating waste disposal directly into the defensive architecture, or as a fundamentally flawed system that created as many health problems as it solved. Some see it as a sign of ingenuity, making the best of the available technology. Others see it as a clear indicator of the era's ignorance about sanitation, creating a pillar of filth that was both a health hazard and an olfactory nightmare. You decide to forgo the experience for now. The cold draft from the stone seat and the potent smell are enough to send you backing out of the small chamber. As you close the door, you have a newfound appreciation for the simple, unglamorous magic of the modern nest bin and the flush toilet. The garderobe was a practical solution to a universal problem, but it was a solution that created a whole new set of issues, starting with what was happening directly below your feet. 50 feet down on the outside of the castle, you step out of the cold, cramped garderobe chamber. A little shaken by the directness of its design, you find yourself drawn to a narrow spiral staircase nearby, one of those tight stone corkscrews that seem to be a staple of castle architecture. It leads down, and your curiosity gets the better of you. You want to see the outpart of this waste disposal system. You carefully descend the worn stone steps, emerging into a small postern gate, a kind of back door to the castle that opens to the outside. You step through the low archway and find yourself on a narrow path at the very base of the massive castle wall. You are standing directly below the spot where the keep's main garderobes are located, and the sight and smell that greets you is exactly what you were afraid of. Piled up against the stone foundation is a massive, foul-smelling mound of human waste. This is the terminus of the garderobe chutes. For years, perhaps decades, everything deposited in the chambers above has tumbled down the wall to collect here. The pile is several feet high, a dark, decomposing mass that steams gently in the cool air. The smell is eye-wateringly intense, a concentrated version of the ammonia scent from the chamber above, mixed with a deeper, more organic odor of decay. Flies swarm over it in a thick, buzzing cloud. This is the castle cesspit, though in this case, it's not so much a pit as a pile. In some castles, a pit would be dug at the base of the wall to contain the waste, but here, it's just been left to accumulate. This feature had a wonderfully blunt medieval name, the dung heap or Jake's pile. It was a notorious and unavoidable feature of castle life. The location of these piles created some interesting and rather disgusting strategic vulnerabilities. During a siege, attacking soldiers knew exactly where the garderobes were located. Thanks to the telltale stains and piles, the chutes themselves could become a point of entry. There's a famous, if gruesome, story from the siege of Château-Gaillard in France in 1204. One of King Philippi's soldiers, a man named Peter the Donkey, reportedly led a small team of men to infiltrate the castle by climbing up a garderobe chute. It's a testament to both their bravery and the sheer awfulness of medieval warfare. This leads us to the grim job of the gong farmer, the same profession we mentioned in relation to the moat. Their work wasn't limited to dredging waterways. They were also responsible for clearing out these cesspit dung heaps. It was a job that could only be done at night, due to the horrific smell and the social taboo associated with it. They would shovel the accumulated waste into carts and haul it away, often to be sold to local farmers as fertilizer. It was a primitive form of recycling, turning the castle's waste into a valuable agricultural commodity. But the men who did this work were social outcasts, their profession marking them as perpetually unclean. A little-known fact about these waste piles is their archaeological value. Much like the midden heaps of kitchen waste, these cesspites are treasure troves for modern archaeologists. By carefully excavating and analyzing the contents, they can learn an incredible amount about the diet and health of the castle's inhabitants. They can find undigested seeds and grains, fish bones, and even the eggs of intestinal parasites, painting a vivid, if slightly unsettling, picture of medieval life from the inside out. The historical debate here centers on the perception of this filth. Did the castle residents see these towering piles of waste as a problem, or was it just an accepted part of the landscape? On one hand, the fact that they hired gong farmers to clear it away shows they recognized that it couldn't be left to accumulate indefinitely. Some castle accounts meticulously record payments to these men, indicating it was a regular, if infrequent, part of the castle's maintenance budget. This suggests an awareness that the build-up was undesirable. On the other hand, the very design of the system, dumping everything at the base of the wall, shows a high tolerance for filth being in close proximity to their living space. The concept of miasma, or bad air, being a source of disease was prevalent. They could clearly smell that the air around the dung heap was bad. But their solution was to redesign the system. It was to hold their noses, perhaps carry a perfumed cloth, and periodically pay someone to haul the problem away for a while. The connection between the waste itself and specific diseases was still not understood, so they lived with a level of filth that would be considered a public health emergency today. You take a step back from the pile, trying to breathe through your mouth. You look up the sheer stone wall, tracing the dark stains that fan out from the small, square openings of the garderobe shoots high above. It's a stark, visual representation of the castle's sanitation system. A problem simply moved from inside to outside, from a private space to a public one, left to fester at the very foundations of their home. It's a powerful reminder that for every convenience, there is a consequence. And in a medieval castle, the consequences were often left in a pile for everyone to see and smell. You decide you've had enough of the castle's exterior sanitation arrangements and quickly retreat back up the spiral staircase. The relative freshness of the smoky great hall is a welcome relief. As night deepens, the hall begins to transform. The trestle tables are being dismantled and stacked against the walls by servants, clearing the main floor space. It's time to see where the upper echelons of this society rest their heads. You manage to get a glimpse into the Lord and Lady's private chamber. The solar. This room is a world away from the communal chaos of the Great Hall. It's smaller, more intimate, and significantly more comfortable. A large fireplace, much more efficient than the central pit in the hall, blazes cheerfully against one wall, casting a warm, flickering light. There are glass panes in the windows, a true sign of wealth, though they are small and latticed. A finely woven tapestry hangs on one wall, depicting a hunting scene. It's not just for decoration. The thick wool provides excellent insulation against the cold stone. The floor here is not covered in rushes, but with a precious, imported carpet, or diorcer, and in other areas, with smooth, polished wooden floorboards. The centerpiece of the room is the bed, and it is magnificent. It's a huge, four-poster affair, intricately carved from dark oak. The sheer size of it is a status symbol in itself, but it's the textiles that truly scream luxury. Heavy curtains of thick, dyed wool or even velvet hang from the canopy, designed to be drawn at night. This created a small, private, and, most importantly, warm room within a room, trapping body heat and keeping out the notorious drafts that plagued even the best-built castles. The mattress, a feather bed, is a thick sack stuffed with down and feathers, an unimaginable comfort compared to the straw pallets used by everyone else. It's covered with fine linen sheets and a pile of fur-lined blankets. It looks like an oasis of comfort and cleanliness. But look closer. The air, while warm, is thick with dust motes dancing in the firelight. The heavy tapestry on the wall, while beautiful, is a perfect home for dust, mold, and spiders. It would have been beaten clean perhaps once a year, but for the rest of the time, it was a silent collector of airborne grime. The wooden floorboards, while a huge improvement over rushes, have wide gaps between them. Every crumb, every stray hair, every bit of dust that falls gets strapped in those cracks, creating a hidden reservoir of dirt. And let's talk about those gorgeous bed curtains. While they provided warmth and privacy, they also created a dark, sealed, and unventilated space. Any moisture from breath would be trapped within the hangings, making them a perfect breeding ground for mold and mildew over time. The smell inside the drawn curtains in the morning must have been quite personal. This brings up a fascinating, if slightly gross, bit of trivia about medieval bedrooms. The chamber pot, while the garderobe was the main toilet, it was often located down a cold, dark corridor. No one, not even a lord, wanted to make that journey in the middle of the night. The solution was the chamber pot, a simple ceramic or pewter bowl kept under the bed. In the morning, it was the job of a servant to empty it. And where did they empty it? Sometimes in the garderobe, but just as often, they would simply open the window, then toss the contents out into the courtyard or moat below. This is the origin of the cry garde-l'eau, from the French garde is l'eau, meaning watch out for the water, which people would shout as a warning before emptying their pots onto the street below. The academic debate here involves the concept of privacy. We see this private chamber as a retreat, a space for the individual, but was it truly private in the medieval sense? Historians argue that our modern idea of privacy didn't really exist. The Lord and Lady's chamber was also their private office and a reception room for important visitors. High-ranking servants, like a lady-in-waiting or a personal valet, would often sleep on pallets at the foot of the great bed. They were always on call. The bed itself, while private, was also a symbol of the lineage and power of the family. It was where heirs were conceived and born. So, while it was a separate space, it was far from a solitary one. You look at the grand bed, with its promise of a warm, soft sleep. It represents the absolute pinnacle of comfort available in this world. It's a carefully constructed bubble of warmth and luxury. Yet, even here, in the most privileged space in the entire castle, the fundamental realities of the medieval world creep in at the edges. The dust in the air, the dirt between the floorboards, the chamber pot under the bed, and the ever-present drafts that the tapestries and curtains fight a losing battle against. It's a reminder that true escape from the grit and grime of the era was impossible, even for a lord. And as you'll soon discover, even this luxurious bed was not a place where one necessarily slept alone. The lord's bed, with its rich draperies and feather mattress, looks incredibly inviting. It's the very picture of slumbering luxury. You imagine sinking into that soft featherbed, pulling the heavy curtains closed, and drifting off into a warm, draft-free sleep. It's a lovely thought, but you would not be the only living creature enjoying the bed's comforts. You would have company, lots of it, and none of it human. Welcome to the hidden ecosystem of the medieval bed. The main residence, aside from yourself, would be a thriving population of fleas, pule, exeritans, Lyspediculus humanus, and the most dreaded of all nocturnal visitors, bedbugs Chemixlectularius. These tiny creatures were an inescapable part of life for everyone, from the poorest peasant to the king himself. Let's start with the mattress and bedding. That wonderful featherbed, the linen sheets, the woolen blankets, and the fur throws were a 5-star hotel for vermin. They provided warmth, humidity, and countless places to hide and lay eggs. The organic materials themselves were a source of food for some insects. And, of course, the main attraction was a warm-blooded meal, conveniently available for 8 hours every night. Fleas were everywhere. They didn't just live in the bedding. They lived in the rushes on the floor, on the dogs and cats that wandered the castle, and in the clothes people wore. The great hall was a flea nursery. When you walked into the solar, you brought them with you on your clothes. When you got into bed, they happily made the transfer to a warmer, more food-rich environment. Waking up with a series of small, itchy red bites was as normal as waking up hungry. Lice were even more personal. They lived in people's hair and in the seams of their clothing, laying their eggs nets directly on the hair shafts or fabric fibers. In an era where full body washing was infrequent and clothes were worn for long stretches, lice populations could flourish. People used special fine-tooth combs, often made of bone or wood, to literally comb the lice and nits out of their hair. This was a daily grooming ritual for many. These combs are very common archaeological finds. a testament to the universal struggle against these persistent parasites. But the true terror of the night was the bedbug. These flat, reddish-brown insects are masters of stealth. They hide in the cracks of the wooden bed frame, in the seams of the mattress, and behind the tapestries on the wall during the day. At night, drawn by the carbon dioxide you exhale into your body heat, they emerge from their hiding places to feed. Their bites could leave behind large, painful, and intensely itchy welts. This brings us to a weird piece of historical trivia. Medieval pest control. People were not passive victims of this nightly assault. They fought back with a variety of ingenious, if not always effective, methods. They would stuff their mattresses with aromatic herbs like wormwood, mint, and pennyroyal, which were believed to repel fleas and other insects. They would scrub their wooden bed frames with concoctions of vinegar or lye, a particularly strange remedy found in a 15th century manuscript suggests catching bedbugs with a piece of rabbit's skin or by placing hollowed out beams at the foot of the bed. The logic behind some of these cures is lost to us. The academic debate on this topic revolves around the psychological impact. Did the constant presence of these parasites cause significant distress, or was it simply accepted as a minor annoyance of life, like flies in the summer? Some historians, reading personal letters and diaries, find evidence of real frustration and misery caused by infestations. They point to the numerous remedies and prayers against vermin as evidence that people were desperate for a solution. It was an itch you could never truly scratch. Other scholars suggest that people had a much higher tolerance for it. In a world full of daily hardships called hunger, disease, a few bug bites were low on the list of concerns. They argue that the concept of vermin as something utterly repulsive and unacceptable is a modern one, born of our sanitized, insect-free homes. For medieval people, these creatures were just another part of the great chain of being, another small cross to bear. You look again at that magnificent bed. The intricate carvings on the oak frame suddenly look less like art and more like 1,000 perfect hiding places for bedbugs. The plush feather mattress seems less like a cloud of comfort and more like a teeming metropolis of microscopic life. Even the most luxurious retreat in the castle was, in reality, a battlefield. The war was fought every night, a silent, tiny struggle between human and insect. And more often than not, the insects won. The itch of a flea bite was the great equalizer, a reminder that in the dark, under the covers, the lord of the castle was just as vulnerable as the stable boy. Having contemplated the microscopic drama unfolding in the lord's bed, you turn your attention away from the solar and back to the great hall. The trestle tables have been cleared, and the central fire has been banked for the night, casting a low, orange glow. The vast, smoky hall, which was a hub of activity just hours ago, is now transforming into a giant dormitory. This is where a large portion of the castle's population will sleep. There are no beds here, no privacy, no curtains, no feather mattresses. The servants, the lower-ranking men-at-arms, the various artisans and retainers who don't have a designated spot in the barracks or service quarters simply find a space on the floor. They unroll a thin pallet. If they're lucky, a pallet, or paillas, was a simple sack, usually made of rough canvas, stuffed with whatever was available. This was most commonly straw or hay, which had to be changed periodically as it became compacted, smelly, and infested with vermin. If you didn't have a pallet, you slept on the rushes themselves. You watch as a small group of kitchen hands finds a spot not too far from the fading warmth of the central hearth. They lay down their thin pallets, which look pitifully inadequate against the cold stone floor. Their blankets are rough, thatched wool. They use their own clothes. Bundled up as a pillow, they lie down, side by side, a row of huddled shapes in the dim light. There is no personal space. The concept would be laughable here. You sleep where you can, next to whoever is next to you. The sensory experience of sleeping in the great hall would be intense. The air is still thick with the lingering smells of the day. Stale wine, grease, wood smoke, then the musty, sour scent of the unwashed rushes beneath you. The hall is far from quiet. you'd hear the snores, coughs, and muttering of dozens of your fellow sleepers. The dogs that wandered the hall during the day are now curled up amongst the sleeping bodies, occasionally whining or scratching. And from the high, dark rafters, you might hear the scrabbling and squeaking of rats. This communal sleeping arrangement washed just for the lowest of the low. Even higher-ranking squires or attendants might sleep on pallets in their lord's chamber, as we've discussed. But for the bulk of the household, the great hall was their home. From morning till night, they ate here, worked here, and slept here. Their entire lives played out in this one vast public space. A curious piece of information about these sleeping arrangements is the huddling for war. In the depths of winter, a stone castle was brutally cold. The fireplace in the hall did little to warm the vast space. The most effective way to stay warm was to use shared body heat. People would sleep pressed close together, not for comfort or affection, but for simple survival. This, of course, magnified all the other problems. If the person next to you has a hacking cough, you're breathing in the same air. If their palate is infested with fleas, those fleas are now your fleas. It was a perfect environment for the rapid transmission of illnesses and parasites. The historical debate here centers on the social dynamics of these sleeping arrangements. Was it a chaotic free-for-all, or were there unspoken rules governing who slept where? Some social historians argue that even in this seemingly disorganized mess, a clear hierarchy was maintained. The most desirable sleeping spots, those closest to the fire for warmth, or furthest from the drafty main doors, would be claimed by the more senior or respected members of the household staff, like the steward or the head groom. The newest, lowest-ranking potboy would be relegated to the coldest, most unpleasant quarter. The layout of the sleeping bodies on the floor would be a silent map of the household's power structure. Other historians suggest it was more fluid, depending on the specific household and the temperament of its members. They point to accounts of camaraderie and shared life among servants, suggesting that the experience, well heard, could also foster a sense of community. They were, quite literally, all in it together. The shared misery of a cold night could build bonds that were impossible to form in the more stratified world of the day. You look at the sleeping forms, scattered across the floor like fallen leaves. You see the rise and fall of their breathing. A man turns over in his sleep, his rough blanket shifting. The fire pops, sending a brief shower of sparks into the air. And for a moment, the scene is almost peaceful, but the reality is harsh. This was a life with no privacy, little comfort, and a constant, low-level struggle for basic warmth and rest. The line between public and private, between work and rest, was almost non-existent. As you stand there in the quiet hall, you realize the immense gulf between the bed and the solar and the floor here. It wasn't just a difference in comfort. It was a difference of entire worlds, separated by just a few stone walls and a flight of stairs. The castle was a single, self-contained organism, but the lives of its individual cells were vastly, starkly different. Your tour of the castle's sleeping arrangements has given you a pretty clear picture of the human inhabitants, from the lord in his featherbed to the servant on the floor. But as you stand in the quiet of the great hall, you become aware of another parallel society living within these walls. The animals, not the livestock in the outer bailey, but the creatures who share the indoor spaces with humans. We've already met the dogs. They are not the pampered lapdogs of modern life. They are working animals, first and foremost. Large, powerful hounds for hunting deer and boar. Smaller, quicker terriers for chasing out rats and foxes. But their work and home life were not separate. After a day of hunting, they weren't relegated to a kennel. They had the run of the castle. You saw them in the great hall, acting as a furry cleanup crew. And now you see them curled up, sleeping among the servants, sharing and receiving warmth. Their hygiene was, to put it charitably, non-existent. They would come in from the muddy courtyard, or a long hunt, their paws caked in mud and worse, and wander freely through the living quarters. They would shake, scratch, and shed wherever they pleased. The rushes on the floor were as much their bedding as anyone else's. This close cohabitation meant a constant, easy transfer of fleas, ticks, and other parasites from animal to human. Yet, they were valued members of the household, often appearing in portraits alongside their noble masters. Their utility as hunters and guards far outweighed any concerns about the dirt they brought inside. Then there are the cats. Like the dogs, castle cats were not primarily pets. They were professional pest control officers. Their sole purpose was to wage a relentless war against the castle's massive population of rats and mice. You saw one in the kitchen, but they were everywhere. In the granaries, the storerooms, and slinking through the rafters of the great hall. They were semi-feral, lame, and self-sufficient. A good mouser was highly prized. This practical relationship with cats is a fascinating slice of medieval life. This brings us to a strange but true fact. The color of your cat mattered. During the height of the witch hunts in the later Middle Ages, black cats, in particular, became associated with witchcraft and bad luck. Some people believed witches could transform into black cats. This superstition led to the widespread persecution of black cats, which, ironically, may have had a negative impact on the rodent-controlling cat population, potentially exacerbating the spread of diseases carried by rats. The primary target of these feline hunters was, of course, the rodents. Rats and mice were an ever-present reality of castle life. They were drawn by the enormous quantities of stored food, sacks of grain, barrels of salted meat, wheels of cheese. They nested in the thatch of outbuildings, in the walls of the keep, and in the multi-layered filth of the rush floors. They contaminated food with their droppings, gnawed through storage containers, and were a general nuisance. The battle against them was constant and largely a losing one. Traps were set, cats were encouraged, but the sheer number of hiding places and the abundance of food meant the rodent population was always booming. The academic debate here focuses on the human-animal relationship in the medieval period. Was it purely utilitarian, or was there a concept of animal companionship as we know it? The evidence is mixed. On one hand, the primary value of an animal was its usefulness. A horse was for transport, a cow for milk, a dog for hunting, a cat for mousing. Animals that couldn't perform their function were quickly disposed of. On the other hand, there is plenty of evidence of genuine affection. Noble ladies often kept small lapdogs purely for companionship. Knights were famously devoted to their war horses, giving them names and treating them with great care. There are poems and stories about beloved pets. The famous 14th century book, The Goodman of Paris, includes detailed instructions on how to care for your small dogs, telling the young wife to keep them clean and well-fed, and to let them sleep in your lap. This suggests that the line between a working animal and a cherished pet was often blurry. People lived in such close proximity to animals that complex relationships, blending utility and affection, were inevitable. As you stand there in the dark hall, you hear a faint scratching sound from the wall nearby. A mouse, perhaps, or a rat in the rafters above. A sleeping dog sighs and shifts its position on the floor. These sounds are the pulse of the castle's other inhabitants. They are a reminder that the stone fortress was not just a human dwelling. It was a complex ecosystem, a shared habitat where the lives of people and animals were inextricably intertwined. The dogs provided security, the cats provided sanitation of a sort, and the rats and mice provided a constant, humbling reminder that humans were not the only masters of this domain. The night deepens, and a chill seeps from the stone walls, a cold that seems to settle deep in your bones. You hear someone cough from across the hall, a deep, trusty, lingering cough. It's a raw, unpleasant sound that echoes slightly in the cavernous space. It gets you thinking, what happened when people in this environment got sick? With the contaminated water, the questionable food hygiene, the vermin, and the crowded, unsanitary living conditions, illness must have been a constant companion. If you fell ill in this castle, your treatment would be based on a medical system that had little to do with science as we know it. The dominant medical theory, inherited from the ancient Greeks and Romans like Galen, was the doctrine of the four humors. the body was believed to contain four essential fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. A healthy person had these four humors in perfect balance. Sickness was caused by an imbalance, too much or too little of one of the humors. So, if you developed a fever and a flushed face, the physician, or leech, would diagnose you with an excess of blood. The logical cure: to remove the excess. This led to the most famous and widespread medical procedure of the era: bloodletting. The leech might open a vein with a small knife called a lancet, or apply leeches to your skin. The leeches would latch on, gorge themselves on your blood, and then drop off. The amount of blood to be let was carefully calculated based on your age, complexion, the time of year, and the alignment of the stars. It was a complex, if completely wrong, system. What if you had that hacking cough? It might be diagnosed as an excess of phlegm, a cold and moist humor. The treatment would involve trying to restore balance by introducing hot and dry things. You'd be prescribed foods like pepper and ginger, told to stay in a warm, dry room, and maybe given a potion made with warming herbs. Every illness was categorized by its humoral properties, and the cure was always its opposite. Another pervasive theory was that of miasma, which we've touched upon. This was the belief that disease was spread by bad air, foul-smelling vapors rising from swamps, decomposing matter, or other sources of filth. You can see the logic. Places that smell bad, like the moat or the cesspit pile, were often places where people got sick. They made the correct observation but drew the wrong conclusion. They thought the smell itself was the disease, not the invisible microbes that were causing both the smell and the sickness. This belief in miasma leads us to a fascinating unfragrant piece of trivia: the pomander. This was a small, perforated metal ball, often beautifully decorated, filled with aromatic substances like ambergris, musk, cloves, and other spices. A wealthy person would carry this pomander on a chain, holding it up to their nose when passing through a particularly smelly area. It was a personal air freshener, a tiny weapon against the onslaught of bad smells. They believed that by breathing in the good air from the pomander, they could ward off the diseases carried on the bad air. It was a form of aromatic armor. The historical debate here revolves around the effectiveness of medieval medicine. Was it all just harmful superstition, or were there elements that actually worked? The cynical view is that most medical interventions, especially bloodletting, were more likely to harm the patient than help them. Weakening an already sick person by removing their blood is rarely a good idea. Many people likely survived in spite of their treatment, not because of it. However, a more nuanced view acknowledges that not all medieval medicine was useless. They had an extensive knowledge of herbal remedies, or simples. Many of these herbs had genuine, if mild, medicinal properties that are recognized by science today. Willow bark, for example, contains HYGIENE, a natural pain reliever and anti-inflammatory agent, the basis for modern aspirin. Poultices of certain leaves could have antiseptic properties. The Cistercian monks, in particular, were known for their well-tended herb gardens and their practical medical knowledge. While their theoretical framework, the humors, was wrong, centuries of trial and error had given them a practical pharmacology that sometimes worked, even if they didn't know why. You hear the man cough again. In this world, there are no antibiotics to treat his pneumonia, no painkillers beyond alcohol and a few herbs, no understanding of how his sickness might spread to the person sleeping next to him. His fate rests in the strength of his own immune system and the dubious wisdom of a leech who might prescribe a good bloodletting to balance his humors. Sickness was a terrifying, unpredictable force, a personal battle fought with the blunt and often broken tools of a pre-scientific age. The night wears on, punctuated by the occasional cough, snore, and the distant cry of an owl. You find yourself thinking about the smaller, more personal aspects of hygiene. You've seen the grand scale of filth in the moat and the intimate discomfort of fleas in the bed. But what about something as simple as a smile? In a world without modern dentistry, what did people do about their teeth? You look around at the sleeping faces in the firelight. It's impossible to tell from here But the reality of medieval dental health was generally poor. Sugary diets were not the primary problem for most of the population, as sugar was an expensive luxury. The main culprit was wear and tear. The bread that formed a staple of the diet was often coarse and gritty. Stone ground flour frequently contained tiny particles of the grindstone, which acted like sandpaper on the teeth, wearing down the enamel over time. This, combined with a lack of effective cleaning, led to decay, abscesses, and tooth loss. So, how did they try to keep their mouths clean? They didn't have toothbrushes with nylon bristles, but they did have the concept of cleaning their teeth. The most common method was to use a rag. You would take a piece of rough linen or wool, dip it in water or a cleaning solution, and rub your teeth and gums with it. It was a simple, abrasive method of removing food particles and plaque. For toothpaste, they used a variety of powders and pastes, some of which sound rather alarming to us. A common ingredient was salt, which is a mild, abrasive and antiseptic. They also used powdered forms of chalk, charcoal, or even brick dust. These abrasive powders would be applied with the finger or the rag to scrub the teeth clean. While this might have removed some surface stains, it also would have been incredibly harsh on the enamel, likely accelerating the wear from their gritty diet. To freshen the breath, which was a constant concern, they would chew on various herbs. Parsley, mint, and cloves were popular choices. Cloves, in particular, were prized because they contain eugenol, a natural antiseptic and anesthetic. Chewing on a clove could help to numb the pain of a toothache, a piece of folk wisdom that had real pharmacological backing. They would also create mouthwashes, often with a base of wine or vinegar, in which herbs like rosemary or mint were steeped. Swishing with this vinegar was thought to cleanse the mouth and sweeten the breath. This brings us to a particularly odd dental hygiene fact: the use of urine as a mouthwash. This was a practice that dated back to the ancient Romans, who famously imported urine from Portugal for its supposed whitening properties. The ammonia in urine does have bleaching and antiseptic qualities. While it was not a widespread or daily practice in the Middle Ages, there are references to it as a medicinal rinse, particularly for treating infections or canker sores. The thought of starting your day with a urine gargle is horrifying, but it shows how they used the limited resources and knowledge they had to tackle their health problems. The academic debate in this area is about the actual state of medieval teeth. The traditional view is that everyone had terrible, rotten teeth. However, modern archaeological analysis of skeletal remains paints a more complicated picture. While evidence of abscesses, plaque buildup, calculus, and extreme wear is common, the rate of cavities caries was often lower than in subsequent centuries, particularly after sugar became cheap and widely available. Their coarse, low-sugar diet, while terrible for wearing teeth down, was less likely to cause the specific type of decay we see today. So, what happened when a tooth did go bad? There were no dentists as we know them. Your first stop might be a wise woman with herbal remedies. If that failed, and the pain became unbearable, you would go to the barber surgeon. These were acts of all trades who would cut your hair, let your blood, and pull your teeth. There was no anesthetic, save for a large swig of strong alcohol to dull your senses. The barber surgeon would use a terrifying-looking instrument called a pelican, named for its resemblance to the bird's beak, to grip the tooth and, with a great deal of force and no small amount of prayer, yank it out. The procedure was brutal, and the risk of infection or a broken jaw was high. It was a last, desperate resort. You instinctively run your tongue over your own teeth. The smooth, solid feeling is a luxury you've never consciously appreciated before. In this world, a full set of teeth was a sign of youth. An aching jaw was a constant possibility, and a smile could reveal a story of wear, decay, and loss that was all too common. The simple act of eating without pain was a blessing not everyone enjoyed. The night is at its deepest and darkest now. The fire in the great hall has dwindled to a pile of glowing red embers, providing more of a faint pulse than any real light or warmth. The air is still and heavy, It's in this quiet moment that your nose, now somewhat acclimated to the baseline smells of smoke and old rushes, starts to pick up on the more subtle, personal scents, the undeniable, close smell of unwashed bodies. In an era of infrequent bathing, unlaborious laundry, body odor was a simple fact of life. People sweated. Their clothes, often made of heavy wool, dropped that sweat. The result was a natural human musk that would have been a constant part of the sensory environment. Something people were so used to they likely barely noticed it, unless it was particularly strong. But that doesn't mean they liked it. The wealthy, in particular, waged a constant war against their own smells, employing a fragrant arsenal of weapons to mask the reality of their bodies. We've already mentioned the pomander, that personal air freshener held to the nose. But people also applied scents directly to their bodies and clothes. They didn't have alcohol-based perfumes as we know them. Instead, they used scented oils and solid perfumes, often called unguents or salves. These were made from a base of fat or wax, into which the essences of flowers like roses, violets, or lavender were infused. A noble lady might rub a small amount of this scented salve onto her wrists and neck. It wouldn't last long, but it provided a brief, pleasant aura. They also perfumed their clothing. A common practice was to store linen and other garments in a wooden chest with sackets of dried herbs. Lavender, rose petals, and cedarwood were popular. When you put on your clothes in the morning, they would carry a faint, clean scent. This was as much about protecting the fabric from moths as it was about smelling nice. One of the most interesting weapons against body odor was the spice ball, or musk ball, a more personal and potent version of the pomander. This was a ball of solid perfume, made with a base of wax or resin mixed with extremely expensive and powerful aromatic ingredients like musk from the musk deer, civet from the civet cat, and ambergris, a waxy substance from the digestive system of sperm whales. These animal-derived scents are incredibly strong and long-lasting. A noble would carry this musk ball in a small, ornate cage, worn on a chain or belt. The warmth of their body would slowly release the heavy, complex scent, creating a personal cloud of fragrance that would overpower any other odors. This brings us to a slightly bizarre historical tidbit: the belief that some saints, in their state of ultimate holiness, naturally exuded a sweet, floral scent known as the odor of sanctity. When the bodies of certain saints were exhumed and found to be incorrupt, not decomposed and smelling of roses or violets, it was taken as a sign of their divine favor. This created a powerful cultural association. Good smells were linked to holiness and purity, while bad smells were linked to sin, corruption, and the devil. The academic debate in this field questions the true purpose of these perfumes. Was it about seduction and pleasure, as we often view perfume today, or was it primarily a medicinal and protective act? Many historians, reading medieval texts, argue for the latter. In the framework of miasma theory, a strong, pleasant smell was seen as a shield. By surrounding yourself with the powerful scent of musk or cloves, you were not just masking body odor, you were actively repelling the bad, disease-carrying air. Your personal fragrance was a form of preventative medicine. It was a declaration of health and cleanliness in a world where both were precarious. Other historians argue that we shouldn't dismiss the element of pure aesthetics and status. The ingredients for these powerful perfumes, musk, ambergris, frankincense, were incredibly rare and expensive. Imported from far-off lands, using them was a blatant display of wealth. When a lord or lady walked into a room, their fragrance preceded them, announcing their status before they even spoke. It was an olfactory way of separating themselves from the great, unwashed masses. The scent was just a shield. It was a crown. You think about the layers of scent in this castle. The base layer is the raw, organic smells of life. Wood smoke, dirt, animals, and sweat. Laid over that, for the privileged few, is a carefully constructed layer of imported spices, fragrant herbs, and animal-icy musks. It's a complex tapestry of smells, a constant battle between the natural and the artificial, the common and the luxurious. In this world, how you smelled was a direct reflection of who you were. And for most people, that meant smelling simply and honestly human. The first faint hint of dawn begins to touch the high windows of the great hall, turning the narrow slits from black to a deep, bruised gray. The castle is beginning to stir. The first servants are moving, rekindling the fire, their movements quiet and practiced. Soon, the entire fortress will hum back to life. Before the chaos of the day begins, you decide to take one last exploratory walk, this time through the heart of the castle's infrastructure, the inner courtyard, or bailey. You step out of the hall and into the pre-dawn chill. The air is damp and cold. The courtyard, which was a whirlwind of activity yesterday, is now quiet and still, but the evidence of its daily life is everywhere. The ground, a mix of packed earth and gravel, is not a flat, clean surface. It's a landscape of miniature hills and valleys, dotted with puddles of murky water from last night's floor washing and who knows what else. The first thing you notice is the mud. It's not just dirt and water. It's a thick, sticky, organic mud, enriched by a constant supply of animal droppings. You have to watch your step. A flock of chickens, early risers, is already pecking around a pile of horsemen or near the stables. The smell of the stables, the potent mix of high-end ammonia, is much stronger in the still morning air. You see the smithy. It's forge cold and dark, but the ground around it is black with coal dust and littered with small, discarded scraps of metal. Next to it is the brewery, and the sweet, malty smell of fermenting grains hangs heavy in the air, a surprisingly pleasant counterpoint to the other odors. This courtyard is the castle's engine room, and like any engine room, it gets messy. It's the main thoroughfare for everyone and everything. Carts laden with firewood or sacks of flour churn the ground into a quagmire. Soldiers tramp through in their muddy boots. Horses in livestock are led back and forth from the stables to the gate. Any semblance of a clean, graveled surface would be quickly lost under the constant traffic and debris. This is where you define the workshops for various crafts that were too noisy, smelly, or dirty to be housed inside the keep. You might see a tanner's workshop for smaller leather repairs, its foul smell contained in one corner. A dyer might have vats of colorful, chemical-laden water, which would be unceremoniously dumped onto the ground when spent. A carpenter's space would be littered with sawdust and wood shavings. Each of these activities contributes its own unique form of waste to the courtyard's rich tapestry of filth. A particularly interesting, unmessy feature you might find in a corner of the bailey is a falconry mews. Falconry was an immensely popular sport among the nobility, and the birds of prey falcons, hawks, and eagles were incredibly valuable. They were housed in a special building or enclosure called a mews. The floor of the mews would be covered in sand or gravel, but cleaning up after birds of prey, with their droppings and the remains of their meaty meals like chicken heads or small birds, was a constant and smelly task. The academic debate here concerns the management of this space. Was the courtyard an uncontrolled mess, a chaotic free-for-all of mud and waste, or was there a system to the madness? Some historians, studying castle layouts and records, argue for a degree of organization. They suggest that the most noxious activities, like butchering or tanning, were deliberately placed in the downwind corner of the bailey. Drains, even simple open ditches, were sometimes dug to try and channel the worst of the liquid waste away from the main paths. They argue that while it looks like chaos to us, it was a functioning system that people knew how to navigate. Other historians argue that any attempts at organization were rudimentary and largely ineffective. They believe the default state of the average castle courtyard was one of deep, pervasive filth, especially in wet weather. They point to the lack of widespread paving and the sheer volume of animal and human traffic as evidence that keeping such a space clean, in any modern sense, would have been an impossible task. The mud and muck were simply an accepted part of the environment, a minor inconvenience in the grand scheme of castle life. You navigate your way across the courtyard, trying to stick to the higher, slightly drier patches of ground. You pass the well, and you see a servant already there, cranking the handle. beginning the day's endless task of hauling water. The water she draws will be used to cook food, wash floors, then brew ale, and so the cycle begins again. The courtyard is the hub that connects all the different parts of the castle we've visited. The kitchen, the keep, the well, the workshops, and it reflects the reality of all of them. It's a space that is productive, essential, and fundamentally, unavoidably dirty. The mud that clings to your boots is a souvenir of this reality, a sample of the very ground on which the entire life of the castle was built. As the sun climbs higher, the courtyard becomes a hive of activity once more, and you find yourself reflecting on how the castle's character must change with the seasons. The damp, chilly morning you're experiencing is just one of the castle's many moods. The filth and grime you've witnessed are not static. They are in a constant state of flux, dictated by the weather and the time of year. Let's imagine this castle in the dead of winter. A thick blanket of snow might cover the courtyard, hiding the mud and muck under a deceptively clean, white sheet. The cold would be a bitter, penetrating force. The stone walls would radiate chill, and drafts would find their way into every corner. The inhabitants would huddle close to the fires, their world shrinking to the warmest parts of the room. But the cold had its hygienic advantages. The cesspit pile outside the garderobe would freeze solid, locking away its stench. The moat, if not fed by a running stream, might freeze over, temporarily halting the process of decay. The cold acted as a natural preservative and disinfectant, slowing down decomposition and reducing the smells. The downside, of course, was the bone-deep, relentless cold and the constant struggle to stay warm. Now, picture the castle in the opposite extreme. The height of a hot, dry summer, the sun would beat down on the stone walls, turning the interior of the keep into a stuffy, airless oven. The courtyard would be a dust bowl, every footstep kicking up clouds of fine, gritty dirt that would coat everything. The well-night trend, though, making water even more precious. But the real change would be the smell. The heat would act as a giant accelerator for every process of decay. The moat, now stagnant and warm, would become a bubbling, foul-smelling soup, its stench hanging heavy in the air for miles around. The great Donegal in the outer bailey and the cesspit pile at the base of the garderobe would ripen in the sun, releasing an almost visible wave of putrid odor and attracting swarms of flies of a biblical magnitude. The rush floors inside the great hall, with their months of trapped organic matter, would begin to truly fester in the heat and humidity, their musty scent intensifying. The entire castle would be wrapped in a miasma of its own making. This seasonal variation in smells leads to a curious historical detail. The practice of summering. Wealthy nobles who owned multiple properties would often move their entire household from one castle or manor to another throughout the year. The official reason was often to manage their estates and consume the produce from different lands. However, a compelling theory suggests that a major, if unspoken, motivation was sanitation. After a household had occupied a castle for several months, the sheer accumulation of filth and waste in the latrines, the kitchens, the bedding would make the place almost uninhabitable. Moving the entire court to another residence allowed the vacated castle to be aired out, cleaned, and for nature to do its work of breaking down the waste. It was a grand-scale version of stepping outside for a breath of fresh air. The historical debate here concerns how aware medieval people were of this seasonal sanitary cycle. Did they consciously understand that summer heat made their castles more dangerous and unhealthy? Some scholars argue that the link was clear. They knew that disease, particularly stomach ailments, the flux, was more common in the summer. They attributed this to the corrupt air or miasma, which they could clearly smell was worse in the heat. Their theory was wrong, but their observation was correct. Therefore, the practice of summering, or even just spending more time outdoors in hunting lodges and pavilions, was a deliberate health strategy. Other historians are more skeptical. They argue that the movements of noble courts were driven almost entirely by politics, administration, and agricultural cycles. The sanitary benefits were a happy coincidence, not a primary motivator. They point out that for the vast majority of people who cowed and simply pack up and move the soldiers, the servants, the villagers. There was no escape. They had to endure the castle's seasonal stenches year in and year out. The idea of a sanitary rotation of residences was a luxury so exclusive as to be irrelevant for understanding the average person's experience. You feel a cold breeze sweep through the courtyard, a reminder of the coming autumn. You can imagine the castle in the rain, the courtyard turning into a sea of mud, the damp chill seeping into everything, and the smell of wet wool and damp stone filling the air. Each season would bring its own unique set of challenges and its own specific sensory profile. The castle was just a place. It was a living, breathing organism that changed with the weather. Its fuzz, the smells, the drafts, the dampness were an inseparable part of its rhythm, a constant reminder of the power of the natural world to intrude upon even the most formidable of human creations. The sun is fully up now, and the castle is a symphony of morning sounds. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the shouting of orders, the lowing of cattle being led out to pasture. Amidst this organized chaos, you start to notice a class of people who are almost invisible, yet utterly essential. They are the ones dealing directly with the filth we've spent all this time exploring. They are the cleaning crew, the sanitation department of the medieval castle. You see a young boy, no older than 12, his face smudged with soot. He's using a small shovel and a handcart to clear out the cold ashes from one of the kitchen's massive fireplaces. This ash, as we know, is a key ingredient for making life for the laundry. His job is dusty, dirty, and endless. Every day, the fires burn, and every morning, the ashes must be cleared. In another corner of the courtyard, you see two women on their hands and knees. They are scourers. Their job is to scrub the grease and grime from the surfaces of the kitchen tables, the trestle tables in the great hall, and the wooden benches. Their tools are simple: a bucket of water of questionable cleanliness, a handful of sand or rough reeds to act as an abrasive, and a great deal of elbow grease. Their hands are read and draw from the constant work. Then there is the raker, or muck raker. This is the person, usually a low-status male servant, responsible for the general tidings of the courtyard. You see him now with a long-handled rake, scraping the fresh animal droppings, soiled straw, and other debris into a pile. Later, he will load this onto a barrow and haul it to the main uneagle outside the walls. His is a never-ending battle against the tide of muck produced by the castle's daily life. These are the people who live at the bottom of the castle's social hierarchy. Their proximity to dirt, both literally and figuratively, define their status in a society that associated cleanliness with holiness and high status. Those who dealt directly with waste were seen as the lowest of the low. Their work was essential, but it was also considered demeaning. This brings us to one of the most specialized and unpleasant jobs of all, the gong farmer, or nightman, whom we've mentioned before. This wasn't a live and servant's job. Gong farmers were specialists, contractors hired for a specific, dreadful task, emptying the garderobe cesspit. Because the smell was so overpowering and considered so offensive, they were only allowed to work at night. A team of them would arrive after dark with shovels, buckets, and a cart. They would dig out the years of accumulated human waste from the base of the walls, load it onto their cart, and haul it away to be sold as fertilizer or dumped in a designated field far from the town. A fascinating, if grim, piece of trivia about this job is that it was surprisingly well paid. The work was so unpleasant and the social stigma so great that a gong farmer could earn a very respectable wage. However, the job was also incredibly dangerous. The fumes in a deep, enclosed cesspit could be toxic and suffocating. There are records of gong farmers being overcome by the foul air and dying at the bottom of the pits they were meant to be cleaning. They were the unsung, and often unseen, heroes of medieval sanitation. The historical debate here centers on the agency and lives of these workers. Were they simply faceless drudges, trapped in a life of filth with no hope of advancement? Or did they have their own communities, their own culture, and ways of navigating their low status? Some labor historians argue that these workers, while at the bottom of the social ladder, were not without power. A good, reliable gang farmer was a valuable asset, and they could negotiate their fees. They formed a necessary, if maligned, part of the urban and castle economy. Their work, though disgusting, gave them a niche that no one else wanted. Other historians emphasize the sheer physical hardship and social ostracism they faced. The smell of their trade would have clung to them, marking them in public. They were often forced to live in specific, segregated areas. Their work was not just hard, it was polluting in a social and spiritual sense. They were a constant, living reminder of the dirty reality that the nobility tried so hard to mask with perfumes and rituals. You watch the boy finish with the ashes and move on to his next task. You see the women scrubbing a table, their conversation a low murmur. You see the raker leaning on his rake for a moment, wiping sweat from his brow. These are the people who made the castle function. They lived and worked at the intersection of order and chaos, cleanliness and filth. Their labor, though unglamorous and often invisible to the castle's high-status residents, was the only thing that stood between the community and being completely buried in its own waste. They weren't just cleaning up messes, they were holding back entropy, one cheval fuel at a time. Your perspective on the castle has been shaped, overwhelmingly, by its lack of hygiene, the stinking moat, the filthy floors, the pest-ridden beds, the foul garderobes. It all paints a picture of a rather disgusting place to live. But now, as you stand in the bustling courtyard, you take a moment to look at these features from a completely different angle, not as failures of sanitation, but as elements of a brilliant defensive system. Let's reconsider the moat. Yes, it was a festering, stinking garbage dump, but from a military perspective, it was a superb obstacle. An attacking army couldn't simply run up to the walls with ladders or a battering ram. They had to first figure out how to cross this wide, deep channel of water. Building a causeway or bridge while under fire from the archers on the walls was a deadly and time-consuming task. And, as we discussed, the foulness of the water was its own weapon. Wading through that sludge was not only demoralizing, but also a fantastic way to get a fatal infection from a minor cut. That smell you found so offensive was the smell of security. Now, think about the castle walls themselves. They are tall, thick, and seemingly impenetrable, but we know they have a dirty secret: the garderobe chutes. From a hygiene standpoint, these are a disaster, creating a pile of filth at the base of the wall. But from a defensive standpoint, they are genius. Building a toilet into the wall solved a major logistical problem during a siege, when a castle was sealed off from the outside world for weeks or months. Having a built-in waste disposal system was crucial. You couldn't have soldiers leaving their posts on the battlements to find a latrine. The garderobe was a convenient, efficient solution that kept the defenders at their stations. The strategic placement of the garderobe chutes also had a secondary, if gruesome, defensive purpose. There are accounts of defenders pouring boiling water, oats, or even the contents of chamber pots down the chutes onto attackers who were trying to undermine the base of the wall. The chute that was a toilet 1 minute could become a weapon the next. Even the general lay out of the castle, which seems so chaotic and messy, is a masterclass in defense in depth. An attacker who breaches the outer wall and crosses the moat doesn't win. They find themselves in the courtyard wide, open killing ground, exposed to archer fire from every direction from the keep and the inner walls. The confusing layout, the various buildings, and the muddy ground would break up a charge and create chaos for the attackers, while the defenders would know every nook and cranny. This brings us to a weirdly specific defensive feature related to filth: quicklime. Quicklime is a caustic substance produced by heating limestone. It was used in construction to make mortar, but it was also a nasty weapon. Defenders would throw powdered quicklime from the walls into the faces of attackers. It would get in their eyes, causing intense pain and temporary or even permanent blindness. It could be a devastatingly effective way to repel soldiers trying to scale a ladder. The same material used to build the castle could also be used to defend it in a truly horrible way. The historical debate here is about intentionality. Were these unhygienic features deliberately designed with defense in mind? or were their defensive benefits a happy accident? Some military historians argue that every aspect of a castle's design was subordinate to its military function. The lord and his architect would have absolutely considered the defensive advantages of a foul moat or the strategic placement of a garderobe. They argue that we shouldn't project our modern obsession with hygiene onto a medieval mindset that prioritized security above all else. Other social historians argue that this gives the builders too much credit for strategic foresight regarding sanitation. They contend that the primary driver for these designs was convenience. The moat was the easiest place to dump trash. The garderobe chute was the simplest way to get rid of waste. The fact that these features also happened to be useful in a siege was a secondary bonus, not the primary reason for their design. They argue that the daily reality of the castle's inhabitants was shaped more by convenience and necessity than by a constant, forward-thinking military preparedness. You look up at the imposing stone keep, at the narrow slit windows that are perfect for archery, at the sea arenalions on the battlements that provide cover for defenders. You see the castle not just as a home, but as a machine for survival. Every feature, from the grandest tower to the humblest drain, can be viewed through two lenses, the lens of daily life and the lens of war. The very things that made it a difficult and dirty place to live were the same things that made it a safe place to live. It was a paradox built of stone, a fortress designed to keep enemies out, which inadvertently trapped its own filth within. Your journey through this particular castle has been an intense immersion in the grim, i.e. our side of medieval life. It would be easy to leave with the impression that every single castle in Europe was an identical festival of filth, that wouldn't be entirely accurate. It's important to remember that the Middle Ages spanned 1,000 years in the vast continent. Standards, practices, and resources varied enormously. Not all castles were created equal, and some places were significantly cleaner than others. Let's consider the best case scenarios. A well-managed castle, under the command of a particularly fastidious or wealthy lord, could present a much more pleasant picture. In such a household, the rushes on the floor of the great hall might be changed weekly, or even more frequently. Servants would be tasked with thoroughly sweeping the old rushes out, not just layering new ones on top. The floors might be washed with lye or vinegar solutions. The tapestries would be taken down and beaten more regularly. It was all a matter of labor, and if a lord could afford a larger staff, he could afford a higher standard of cleanliness. The water source also made a huge difference. A castle fortunate enough to be built near a fast-flowing river could have a remarkably sophisticated sanitation system. Instead of a stagnant moat, they could divert part of the river to create a constantly flushing channel. Garderobe chutes could be designed to empty directly into this moving water, carrying the waste immediately away. Kitchens and laundries could have drains that led to the river, preventing the courtyard from turning into a swamp. These waterside castles were the pinnacle of medieval sanitary engineering. However, the cleanest and most well-organized institutions of the medieval period were often not castles at all, but monasteries, particularly those of the Cistercian and Benedictine orders. Monastic life was governed by a strict set of rules that emphasized order, discipline, and cleanliness, which was seen as being next to guidelines. Monasteries were oft unmasterfully engineered. They had complex water management systems, with separate channels for clean water for drinking and cooking, and grey water for washing and powering water mills. Their latrine blocks, known as red or tours, were often large, communal facilities built over running water, providing a constantly flushing sewer system that was far superior to any castle's garderobe. Monks were required to bathe more regularly than most lay people, as part of their ritual purification. Their infirmaries were oft cleaner and better organized than any secular hospital. This brings us to a fascinating, clean freak fact of the era: the monastic laundry schedule, the rule of St. Benedict, which governed many monasteries, had specific regulations about personal hygiene. It stipulated that monks should receive clean clothes from the monastery's laundry on a regular basis, often weekly. This level of laundry service was almost unheard of in the secular world. They had a dedicated team of monks or lay brothers whose entire job was to manage the huge task of washing the habits and bedding for the entire community. The historical debate here is whether this monastic cleanliness was typical or an extreme exception. Were monasteries shining beacons of hygiene in a sea of filth, or were they just slightly better managed versions of the secular world? Some historians argue that the monastic model of sanitation and order had a significant influence on the outside world. Nobles who founded or patronized a monastery would have seen their advanced systems and may have tried to incorporate similar ideas into their own castles. They see monasteries as centers of innovation, not just spiritually, but also practically. Other historians argue that the monastic experience was completely separate and had little impact on the hygiene of the general population. A monastery was a closed, highly regulated community of adult men, which made it far easier to enforce rules of cleanliness. A castle, in contrast, was a chaotic, multi-generational household with children, animals, and a constant flow of visitors. The orderly, clean life of a monk was simply not transferable to the messy reality of a feudal stronghold. They argue that monasteries were an anomaly, a utopian experiment in order that only highlights how dirty the rest of the world was by comparison. So, as you stand in the courtyard of this rather typical, grimy castle, it's worth remembering the exceptions. Somewhere, a few dozen miles away, there might be a Cistercian monastery where the floors are scrubbed, the water runs clean, and the air doesn't carry the constant, heavy scent of decay. Your current host may not be the titties tea of lords, but he is likely the norm. The pristine, orderly exceptions existed, but they were rare. They were the outliers in a world where, for most people, life was a much messier affair. The day is now in full swing. The sounds, smells, and sights of the functioning castle are all around you. Your journey is almost at an end. You've walked the grounds, peered into the darkest corners, and inhaled the complex atmosphere of this medieval world. Now is the moment to step back and contrast the reality you've experienced with the romantic image of castles that lives in our collective imagination. Think of the castles from fairy tales and fantasy movies. They are places of gleaming stone towers, pennants fluttering crisply in a gentle breeze. The halls are filled with noble knights and ladies in pristine, beautiful clothes. The feasts are abundant and elegant. The princesses gaze out of sparkling clean windows from their airy, sunlit chambers. It's a world of magic, honor, and pristine beauty. It is, you now understand, a complete and utter fantasy. Let's do a quick side-by-side comparison. The romantic image shows a great hall with a roaring, smoke-free fire, where elegantly dressed courtiers listen to a lute player. The reality you've seen is a dim, smoky, and crowded room, hazy with soot, where the air is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and the floor is a carpet of greasy, decomposing rushes littered with dog-chewed bones. The fairy tale depicts a princess letting down her long, golden, shimmering hair from a tower window. The reality is that her hair, like everyone else's, was likely a home for lice, which she would diligently try to remove each day with a fine-toothed comb, and the fresh air from her window would carry the stench of the moat or the nearby Donegal. The fantasy shows a knight in shining, polished armor, a walking symbol of purity and strength. The reality is that underneath that armor, he was sweating profusely. His padded undergarments, or gambeson, would be soaked and rarely washed, and after a battle, his shining armor would be dented, spattered with mud and blood, and in desperate need of a squire to scrub it clean of rust. This brings us to a slightly sad piece of historical reality, the destruction of the very evidence we're talking about. The 19th century revival of interest in the Middle Ages, the one that gave us so many of our romantic notions, also lead to a wave of restoration of actual castles. Well-meaning aristocrats and architects would clean up these old ruins, stripping away the centuries of plaster, removing original wooden structures, and generally sanitizing them to fit their idealized vision. In doing so, They often destroyed the very archaeological evidence, the layers of flooring, the original paint, the garderobe deposits that would have told us what these places were really like. They essentially power-washed history, making it harder for us to see the messy truth. The great debate among public historians and museum curators today is how to present this reality to the public. Should they lean into the romantic image that draws tourists in, or should they shatter those illusions with the smelly, dirty truth? Some argue that people visit castles for the fantasy, and hitting them with the full force of the filth would be alienating. They advocate for a softer approach, hinting at the realities without dwelling on the gross details. This approach keeps the magic alive, which is good for tourism and for firing the imagination. Others argue passionately that this does a disservice to history and to the people who actually lived it. They believe that by sanitizing the past, we fail to appreciate the incredible resilience and toughness of medieval people. Understanding their struggles with filth, disease, and discomfort makes their achievements, the art they created, the cathedrals they built, the ideas they developed, all the more remarkable. They advocate for scratch and sniff exhibits, for detailed reconstructions of the dirt, and for telling the unvarnished truth. The goal isn't to be sensational, but to provide a more authentic and ultimately more human picture of the past. You look around at the castle one last time. The stone is not gleaming. It's stained with soot and lichen. The banner is not crisp. It's frayed and damp. The people are not pristine. They are hardworking, sweaty, and real. The romantic image is a beautiful lie. The reality is a complicated, smelly, and fascinating truth. This place was not a fairy tale. It was a home, a fortress, a workplace, and a microcosm of a world that was tougher, smellier, and in many ways more resilient than we can possibly imagine. The fantasy is entertaining, but the reality, you decide, is far more interesting. It's time to leave. The sun is now high enough to have burned off the morning mist, and the castle is fully awake. You've seen all there is to see, smelled all there is to smell. You turn your back on the keep and begin the journey back to your own time, your own world of quiet comforts and invisible cleanliness. You walk back across the courtyard, which is now a controlled pandemonium. You sidestep a cart loaded with firewood, nod to the grim-faced guards practicing with their spears, and avoid a gaggle of geese that are hissing at a stray dog. The mud here feels familiar now, no longer a shock to the system. You reach the main gatehouse, passing once more under the shadow of the portcullis. Its iron teeth seem less menacing now, more like a functional part of a complex machine. Then you are back on the wooden drawbridge. You look down at the moat one last time. The morning sun glints off the greasy film on the water's surface. You can still smell it, but the scent is no longer just foul. It's now layered with meaning in your mind. It's the smell of a garbage dump, yes, but it's also the smell of a formidable defense. It's the smell of health risks and of security, a paradox captured in a single, pungent aroma. You reach the far side and step onto the muddy track leading away from the fortress. You pass the tanneries again, but their chemical stench now seems like just one note in a much larger symphony. You walk past the small village of wattle and daub huts that huddles near the castle walls. This is the suburb we saw on arrival. The community of artisans and laborers whose lives and fortunes were tied directly to the great stone household behind them. They were drawn here by the protection the castle offered and the economic opportunities it provided, creating a symbiotic, if unequal, relationship between the lord within and the common folk without. As you walk, you hear the squeal of pigs. A small herd is being driven by a boy out towards the woods to forage for the day. This brings up a wonderfully mundane, yet important, aspect of medieval town life: pig laws. Pigs were the wandering garbage disposals of the community, but they were also a constant nuisance, getting into gardens and leaving messes. Many towns and manors had specific regulations about keeping your pig properly penned or controlled. It's a reminder that even in an era we think of as lawless, everyday life was governed by a web of practical rules designed to make communal living possible. You continue down the path, the castle shrinking behind you. And this is where you're left with the final Great historical abate of your journey. What was the true sensory experience for the people who lived here? Did they perceive their world as dirty and smelly? Or was this simply their normal? Some historians argue that the constant exposure to powerful odors would have created a different olfactory landscape, where only the most extreme and unusual smells would have even registered. They believe the concepts of filth and stench were reserved for things far worse than the daily background smell of their own homes. Other historians argue that the evidence of their fight against it, the use of perfumes, the cleaning rituals, the very existence of the word stench proves that they were aware of and disliked the filth. They may have been accustomed to it, but they were not happy about it. They argue that the medieval nose was just as sensitive as ours, but it was attached to a person with far fewer options for escape. The truth, as always, is likely somewhere in between, a complex state of resignation, adaptation, and a constant, low-level desire for a breath of fresh, clean air. You reach a bend in the road and stop for one last look back. From this distance, the castle has once again become a romantic silhouette against the sky. The smoke from its chimneys is a gentle plume. The details of the dirt, the grime, and the mess are invisible. The sounds are gone. The smells are gone. It's just a picture again. But you know what's inside. You know the story that the stones tell. The image is clean, but the memory is rich, complex, and fragrant. It's a story that will linger long after you've left its walls behind. And now, that story begins to fade. The hard stone of the castle walls softens into the velvet gray of a dream, its edges blurring into the closing darkness. You are no longer standing on that muddy path. The feeling of the ground beneath your feet dissolves, and you are drifting now, floating in the quiet space between wake signals and sleep. The chorus of the courtyard, the clang of the hammer and the shouting of men, recedes into the faintest echo, a distant memory that no longer needs your attention. The thick, complex smells of smoke and life and decay have thinned into a single, clean scent. Perhaps the memory of lavender from a linen chest, or the cool, damp smell of stone after a rain. All the harsh realities have melted away, leaving only a gentle quiet, a profound and welcome hush. The fire in the great hall is nothing now but a single, pulsing ember in the vast darkness of your mind. Let the quiet settle around you. Let your breathing be slow and even. The journey is over. There is nothing left to see, nothing left to do, just the soft comfort of your own bed, and the deep, peaceful slumber that awaits. The story is over. Let the quiet settle around you, and sleep well.